So here we have Richard Atwood talking to us about the 1970 Porsche 917K, race number 23, which he won the 1970 Le Mans 24 hours in. This car is one of the contenders for Best of Show in Concours Virtual, presented by Haggerty in aid of UNICEF. So straight over to Richard, because he is the star. Richard, by the time you'd got to 1970 Le Mans, you already had experience in, well, you'd started Formula Junior, Formula 2, Formula 1, but you'd been to Le Mans a few times, hadn't you? And you'd had quite an experience in 1969 with the Porsche 917. Perhaps tell us about that first of all.
Yeah, the 917 in 1969 was the first year it went to Le Mans. It had done a couple of other races that year earlier in 69, but it really hadn't been sorted. And I never tested the car at all. And so the first time I drove it was to qualify for the race for 1969. And it was, I knew immediately it was not, a good car aerodynamically, because the 908 Silhouette long tail is exactly the same as the 917, more or less. And that car was didn't reach the same speeds as the 908, but the 908 at its peak performance speed is about just under 200, and that car was felt very light. Steering, the car was literally not on the ground as best it should be. And when the 917 came out, then this became quite a massive problem. And to give you an example of, there's a kink down the straight, the Mulsanne straight at Le Mans, which any car driven before or after is easily flat because they just go around like a normal car would do. But this car, you couldn't do that. So we had to slow, and that gives you an idea of how unstable it was. And to give you another bit of a clue, there were three 917s entered that year, and there was a private entry entered by John Wolfe, and Digby Martin was his co-driver, and he'd never driven anything like this. He was a good peddler in England, as I think Chevron driver, and I know him quite well. And he to qualify to do Le Mans, he had to do 3 laps in the daytime and 3 at night. And he was doing his 3 daytime laps. And on his last qualifying lap, he thought, I better find out exactly what this car is all about. So he went into this curve that I'm talking about, a little bit faster, and completely lost control. He spun for 500 yards, didn't hit anything. And he drove back to the pits in a bit of a state. And he got out of the car, said to John Wolfe, thank you very much for the opportunity to drive here with your car, but I'm now going back home. So it was a very brave decision, I think, of his to do that. But that gives you a good idea of where we're coming from.
And of course, that leads into what happened to John Wolfe, unfortunately, as well, doesn't it?
Well, there was that was another thing, which is a bit more sort of dramatic, I suppose. But yes, that same car, driven by John Wolfe, he insisted in starting the race with it, because he'd got a lot of personnel there and family, and it was his ambition to do that. And the factory tried to dissuade him from doing that, because when Digby Martin went home, Herbert Linger, factory driver, had been allocated to be his co-driver, and the factory wanted Linger to start the race, but John insisted that he did. And I think he probably got carried away with the start. He actually apparently from further down the grid made quite a good start and was going quite well. And he got as far as Whitehouse, which is nearly the end of the lap, which was an extremely fast corner. And I think he possibly thought he was in a normal car, but the bend would be taken at anywhere between 140, so around 140 miles an hour. And he turned the car to go in, and of course it didn't want to know, and that's where actually the start of the Le Mans Steve McQueen film starts with that scenario being the scene of the beginning of the film.
Of course. Yeah. No, it's really, really sad. And after all this, a year later, you went into the 1970 Le Mans.
Yeah.
Back in the 917, the 917 that we're talking about. How did it feel to be back there, and how did the car feel?
Well, I mean, they did quite a lot more testing in later in '69, and they discovered, of course, John Moir was going to bring on was going to be running the works team the following year. Unbeknown to John Moir, there were going to be lots of other cars entered as well by the factory, but John thought he was going to be the sole team. And as a result, he was invited to this test, and John Horsman was there, and he had experience with the GT40, and he knew that it was aerodynamic, and because Brian Redman went to try the car. He was the tester. I think it was in something like September time, so it's a couple of months after the Mans. And when Brian approached the paddock, because he'd arrived by plane and was driven there, and he looked at the car and he said to the engineer who was with him, he said, "But the car looks the same." And said, "Oh yes, we have." They'd modified the whole of the car underneath, not realizing it was still aerodynamic. And so Brian did one lap in that car as it was, and they'd modified everything underneath. And he said it's exactly the same, to which the engineers were shocked and amazed. And immediately John Horsman suggested that, well, the exact story I'm not sure, but I think they removed the tail and tried it without the tail on at all. And he said that it was much improved. So that gave a good inkling. And from there on, they created this upswept short tail car, which is a configuration I drove in 1970. And then the car was perfect. So there's nothing wrong with the car, it's just pure aerodynamic. And it took quite a long time for them to tweak to that. But of course, it was the early days of aerodynamics and Formula One cars. The year before you had wings on stalks. So it was all a bit hit and miss in those days. People theorized a lot on aerodynamics, but not many of them came true. And of course, now it's quite easy to see what is wrong with wind tunnels and everything else. So we found, they found there at the Off-Strike-Ring in, because it was really fast circuit, a bit like Le Mans, the corners at Le Mans, that by creating this upswept tail, that created the necessary downforce on the back of the car to negate lift, I suppose, if nothing else. I mean, because it probably still had a lift, but nothing like the long tail. So for 1970, in February, the factory rang me and they asked me what I would like for Le Mans this following year. And I think they saw the disappointment, what they thought was disappointing in my face, having retired from 1969, because we were way in the lead and we got 3 hours to go and the gearbox broke. And I think they saw in my face disappointment, but actually it wasn't. It was relief on my behalf, because the car had been diabolical to drive through the whole race. And it was, in a way, for me, a shame it lasted so long, because it was a nightmare to drive. And anyway, so they asked me what configuration I wanted for the race. And I said, well, I don't want a long tail. The gearbox had broken the year before. So I said, I want the less powerful engine, the 4.5, not the new 5-litre, which hadn't been proved then anyway. And of course, this is back in February. So, of course, come June, the 5-litre now is a wonderful engine. They've sorted the long tail aerodynamics out to be a really much faster car, which it was. So after qualifying, after practice, we discovered that we were halfway down the grid. I mean, we were just completely uncompetitive. But I said to my wife, I said, we have absolutely no chance in this race because we're just too slow. And the previous year we'd had a 5-speed box. This year they'd modified the gearbox, I think, and it was only a 4-speed, but we weren't allowed to use first gear. So that really put us at a big disadvantage at the slow corners like Mulsanne and Arnage. And we were way off the pace. I mean, I wouldn't know how many seconds, but it was way off. But I said, we've got no chance in this race because we've got so many cars in front of us. One of them is going to prevail. Several probably will prevail. And really, before the race started, I said we don't have a chance. But amazingly, after only 10 hours, we were in the lead. I couldn't believe it when I was told. An unreal race. Well, I don't know if it was unprecedented, but I think there were fewer finishes in that race than there'd ever been. And it was a race of attrition with a lot of the errors were driver errors. And, we lucked in really. But really, we had a lead then to defend. And we had another 14 hours to go, although we were in the lead. And that was the stress factor, I suppose, with the weather conditions we had as well, which we were down to crawling pace some of the time. And today they would have, I'm sure, postponed the race for a while because it was so torrential. But in those days, you drove to whatever you had to drive through for 24 hours, no matter what happened. If you look back to the disasters of 1955, when a car went into the crowd, killing loads of people, the race carried on. Yes. And the same with John Wolf's accident. When he went off on 69, the track was half blocked. The track was on fire, but the race carried on. And that's the difference between now and today.
Yes, totally different, isn't it? It's incredible. And as far as the car itself, was it obviously you were struggling out of the corners and things, but as you say, 10 hours in, you were in the lead. How did the car perform from that point onwards?
There was nothing ever wrong with the car. It was a question of the drivers managing the conditions to make sure they didn't fall off and yet maintained the level of performance necessary to stay ahead of everybody else. Yeah. And so the stress factor the year before was with the dynamics of the car, and that year in 1970 when we won was drive as carefully as you can but as fast as you can because there are people behind you who want to win as well, and the conditions were absolutely diabolical. So that was the 14 hours, long way to go. We weren't even halfway through. I mean, if you scripted the story, I don't think anybody would believe it.
No, and of course you had in the end you had Philly Carlson and Gerard Larousse chasing you down, didn't you, in the long tail?
Yes, they were. I don't recall what was going on particularly, because when you're driving and then when you're resting, you'll get on at rest, so you don't actually catch up with the overall race. And they wouldn't want to give me signals that would make us more concerned. But I think there was an understanding that certainly towards the end that the race was now set, and a bit like today, they were desperate. Porsche were desperate to win, so they had another car behind us as well for insurance. But I don't think they wanted us racing. But I do know that the other car was not sufficiently close enough to do that. They might have pushed on to try to catch us, I don't know. But they did. Porsche at this stage didn't really want to risk anything more. And so they actually finished first, second, and third as well. I think the third car was the 908. So, they were pretty well covered, but they wanted to make absolutely sure, because of course the year before and the history of Porsche at Le Mans really, because they had smaller engine capacity cars, and they usually won their class. They were very successful at Le Mans, and the first one they ever did, they won the class. So, but they wanted the overall thing, and that's really was the key, and that's why we had to. I think everybody had to behave, and we were doing our bit as well.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And so you got to the end. You obviously felt relieved that you'd got through. How were you feeling overall at the end of the race?
Well, unbeknown to me, I did have a infection of mumps, and mumps can affect you here around your glands, or can be lower down. Fortunately for me, it was my right in my glands of my throat, and I couldn't actually eat anything. Anything with any taste would immediately give me a lot of pain in my throat area, and so all I could have was milk. And I don't think there's nothing bland enough to eat that hasn't got a taste.
Mm.
And so I survived on milk, and I tried cornflakes, but of course there's too much taste with cornflakes. So I couldn't take that either. So I was actually pretty much in a bad state at the end of the race, and I didn't really understand why. And there was a special late minute prize, not prize giving, a dinner party from Porsche at a venue I can't remember. And so after the race, we went back to the hotel. Then we had to be at this other venue for the dinner. And I think we got there about 7:30. And I just could not stay awake. It was really something. I thought, I'm a wimp. And I didn't understand it. So actually, after about 20 minutes, we had to go. I was with my wife. We went home. We went to the hotel, and obviously was flat out. And it wasn't until I got back home that I went to see the doctors, and they said, "Oh yes, you've had a case of mumps." Well, I didn't know that, and that's really why I was absolutely wiped out. I mean, I did the race, I did the ceremony of the prize giving, and everything else on the circuit, with purely on adrenaline, I guess, and then my body must have just given up. So I had really nothing much left.
Incredible, isn't it? Yeah, I guess you didn't really get to enjoy your victory then.
Not at all. No.
Looking back now, how do you feel about the victory, and also how do you feel about the car? Because you're reunited with it every now and again, aren't you?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, my connection with Porsche will carry on to this day, and you know, I drive at Goodwood probably at the festival speeds. Certainly, I've driven an i17 every year, sometimes a couple of them. You know, so I'm still. It's just like getting into something I know very well, like a nice pair of shoes or gloves or whatever you happen to think about. But it's a very natural car for me to get into and go take it off the start line, which I like to do quite well, and then I cruise up the rest of the hill.
Yes.
But yeah, and I've done other things for Porsche with programs that they're doing about Le Mans and everything else. So yeah, it's still a great car, and you know, no downforce, which is exactly how cars should be, really, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm a bit old-fashioned.
Yeah.
which is why I enjoy the Goodwood arrival very much.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant, Richard. I won't keep you any longer, but thank you so much for going through that. I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy watching this. So thank you very much.